Keanu Reeves stepped aboard the $150 million super yacht Celestial Symphony, wearing nothing but a weathered hoodie, faded jeans, and a vintage baseball cap. No one recognized him. They snickered at his appearance, ridiculed his casual attire, and whispered that he clearly didn't belong. One individual in particular, Maxwell Thornton, publicly humiliated him before everyone present. What these people failed to realize was that Keanu wasn't just an ordinary passenger. And when the truth finally emerged, the entire room fell into a profound, deafening silence. The brilliant sun hung delicately over Marina del Rey, casting golden streaks across the tranquil Pacific waters as the Celestial Symphony, a floating mansion worth over $150 million, prepared for its most exclusive voyage of the season. This luxury expedition, spanning 7 days, promised more than just ocean breezes and premium champagne. It was a meticulously curated experience for society's upper echelon, culminating in a prestigious charity gala intended to generate millions for pediatric cancer research. The guest list read like a who's who of modern affluence: tech moguls, Wall Street kingpins, Hollywood producers, and the self-proclaimed aristocracy of modern America. Among the procession of impeccably dressed passengers arriving in gleaming Bentleys and chauffeur-driven Maybachs, one figure stood out, not for his extravagance, but for its conspicuous absence. A man in a well-worn gray hoodie, threadbare jeans, and a sun-bleached baseball cap emerged from an ordinary rideshare, carrying only a simple canvas backpack slung casually over one shoulder. He moved with the quiet self-assurance of someone with nothing to prove, yet to onlookers, he appeared utterly out of place in this realm of ostentatious wealth. He walked past a cluster of crew members who eyed him with evident skepticism, then approached the gangway alone, without entourage, without ceremony. At the registration pavilion, a woman in a designer blouse with a gold-embossed name tag greeted guests with the practiced politeness reserved for those who tipped generously. But when she glanced up and saw the unassuming man approaching, her expression faltered momentarily before reassembling into a rigid professional smile. "Good afternoon, sir. May I have your name?" she inquired, already scanning the luxury manifest where she presumed he certainly wouldn't be listed. "Keanu Reeves," he replied simply, his voice calm and unpretentious. The woman hesitated, reviewing the list twice. "I'm sorry, I don't appear to see your name on our passenger registry," she stated, her tone growing increasingly formal. "Are you certain you're in the correct line? This is check-in for VIP passengers." Before he could respond, a commanding voice interrupted from behind. "Is there an issue here?" The man who spoke wore a tailored suit the color of ivory, designer sunglasses perched atop his forehead, and a perpetual smirk that never quite reached his eyes. Maxwell Thornton, CEO of Thornton Enterprises and one of the yacht's most prominent public sponsors, approached with the entitled confidence of someone who viewed the world as his private members' only club. The receptionist turned slightly. "He claims his name is Keanu Reeves, but he's not on the manifest." Maxwell chuckled as he gave Keanu a deliberate, appraising look from head to toe, his smile laced with condescension. The receptionist, emboldened by Maxwell's presence, forced a tight smile and gestured toward the waiting area. "If you could kindly step aside while we verify your information, sir." The honorific sounded hollow and insincere. Keanu nodded once without protest, then quietly moved aside to allow the procession of bejeweled guests to pass by, their expensive fragrances lingering longer than their fleeting glances. No one offered him a seat. No one offered him a refreshment. A pair of young social media personalities in luxury athleisure whispered and giggled as they passed by, one of them discreetly capturing a photo captioned, "Cruise commences and we've already spotted gate crashers." From his position near the registration pavilion, Keanu gazed out toward the open ocean, undisturbed. His posture remained relaxed and at ease. He wasn't here for recognition. He wasn't here to impress. And yet, every dismissive glance, every muttered comment, every derisive chuckle they noticed him. They all did. They just didn't know who he truly was, not yet. The afternoon sun filtered gently through canvas awnings on the upper deck, casting soft patterns on polished teak and sparkling crystal flutes. It was the second day aboard the Celestial Symphony, and the vessel had truly come alive. Music flowed from concealed speakers, servers navigated between lounge chairs offering platters of delicacies, and the exclusive Horizon Lounge resonated with laughter and the subtle clinking of designer eyewear. This was the sanctuary of the ultra-privileged, a space deliberately crafted to exude exclusivity and sophistication. Keanu, dressed identically to the previous day, gray hoodie, worn jeans, weathered cap, wandered quietly through the corridor leading to the lounge, drawn not by the luxury but by the unobstructed view of the ocean it offered. He paused just before the glass doors, contemplating the horizon where azure waters melted seamlessly into sky. The moment was peaceful, undisturbed. But the tranquility was short-lived. From behind him came the distinctive sound of Italian leather shoes, followed by a voice as smooth and cold as the craft cocktails being served inside. "Well," Maxwell Thornton drawled, crossing his arms with theatrical flair, "look who's found his way to the adult section of the ship." Keanu turned, maintaining his characteristic composure. "Just wanted a clearer view of the ocean." Maxwell released a laugh, short, calculated, dismissive. "Oh, I'm quite sure you did. And I'm certain the housekeeping staff wouldn't mind having extra eyes on the railings, though I must say, you're quite bold. Most of the crew at least wear proper uniforms." Keanu met his gaze directly. "I'm not crew." "Of course you're not," Maxwell replied with exaggerated amusement, turning to glance at two women seated nearby. One of them, a bronzed socialite in a Versace wrap, whispered with a smirk, "He looks like he got lost on his way back to shore." The other suppressed laughter behind her martini glass. Maxwell turned back to Keanu and moved closer, lowering his voice so only they could hear. "Listen, friend, I don't know how you managed to get aboard this vessel, but this isn't some ordinary cruise ship. This is curated company. People invest 8 figures just to breathe this rarefied air, so do yourself a favor, stay in your designated lane." Keanu didn't flinch. "And which lane would that be?" Maxwell leaned in, his voice now dripping with contempt. "The one where no one expects you to speak. The one where you remain invisible unless you're carrying refreshments on a tray." For an extended moment, silence hung between them, broken only by the distant rhythm of waves against the hull. Then Keanu spoke, his voice low and steady, "You think I don't belong here, but maybe, just maybe, this place never belonged to people like you." Maxwell's smirk faltered completely before he could formulate a retort. A passing crew member approached Keanu with a gentle smile. "Excuse me, sir. This area is reserved exclusively for our VIP guests. May I respectfully ask you to relocate to the promenade deck?" Keanu gave the young man a courteous nod. "Of course." He turned to leave, his pace unhurried, posture relaxed. As he walked past Maxwell, he paused just long enough to say quietly, "Thank you for revealing your true character." Maxwell remained motionless, his jaw visibly tightening. Behind him, the two women exchanged knowing glances. One murmured, "He's probably some washed-up performer pretending he belongs here." The other shrugged indifferently. "He'll be gone by tomorrow. People like that always disappear quickly." But Keanu didn't hear them, or perhaps he did and chose to let the weight of silence speak more eloquently than any response. The third day brought with it an extravagant brunch arrangement on the upper sundeck. A sea of pristine linen-draped tables, crystal chandeliers swaying gently in the ocean breeze, and a playlist meticulously selected to suggest affluence without effort. Servers in immaculate black attire circulated with platters of gourmet delicacies, chilled premium wines, and elegant menus listing dishes that required translation. Keanu entered quietly, dressed identically as before. His presence didn't command attention, but it disrupted the rhythm of a crowd that had begun to recognize him not for who he truly was, but for who they presumed he wasn't. He took a seat at an unoccupied table near the railing, where the view expanded magnificently to a silver-blue horizon. He poured himself water from a crystal carafe and reached for a modest plate of artisanal bread, silent and unobtrusive. The mockery began from 3 tables away. "Christ, who allowed the maintenance guy into brunch?" barked a man with a meticulously groomed appearance and Italian loafers without socks, a venture capitalist from Silicon Valley, or at least pretended to be. His voice was deliberately loud, intended to carry. "Are we implementing charitable seating arrangements now? Perhaps we should offer him a few crumbs while we're at it," chimed in a brunette behind oversized designer sunglasses, her voice dripping with insincerity. Maxwell Thornton, seated among them, didn't even glance up from his seasonal fruit plate. "That's not maintenance staff," he stated flatly. "That's the stowaway I mentioned earlier." Someone whistled sarcastically. Pretty audacious of him to reappear. Does he not own a mirror? Maxwell finally looked up. He owns something, I'm sure. A bus pass, perhaps. Maybe a tent. Another woman at the table, young and ostentatiously dressed, narrowed her eyes. Do you think he might be dangerous? Look at how he sits, like he's completely indifferent to who might be watching. Because he doesn't belong, Maxwell replied, his voice now sharp and pointed, like a blade wrapped in silk. He carries no shame because men like him have no concept of what dignity feels like. At that moment, a server approached Keanu with an elegant plate of house-cured salmon. Before the attendant could place it down, Maxwell raised his hand and called out, "Are you certain that table's been properly sanitized?" "I'm quite sure he's not a registered guest." The entire section of the sun deck fell silent for a beat. The server hesitated, visibly uncomfortable. Keanu looked up calmly. "It's perfectly fine. I can serve myself," he said gently, accepting the plate from the server with a subtle nod of appreciation. "Oh my, he speaks," someone sneered. Another added, "Careful now, you might startle him. He could scurry back to the engine room." As Keanu began his meal, one of the women, her judgment impaired by premium champagne before noon, rose dramatically from her seat and walked deliberately to his table. She leaned in, her voice a hushed, mocking whisper just audible enough for nearby guests. "Tell me," she slurred, "do you actually believe you're invisible here, or do you simply enjoy being a spectacle?" Keanu didn't respond. She scoffed and straightened her posture. "Or perhaps you're just hoping someone wealthy takes pity and adopts you like a stray." This elicited raucous laughter from her companions. Maxwell clinked his glass against hers as she returned, triumphant in her cruelty. Keanu calmly folded his napkin, stood, and placed his barely touched plate on a nearby tray. Then he turned to face them, not with anger, but with something that unsettled them more profoundly, silence and a penetrating gaze that seemed to see through every carefully constructed facade. A pause, then with quiet dignity, he said, "It's always remarkable how the loudest criticisms originate from the most fragile sense of self-worth." And with that, he walked away, not hurriedly, not deliberately, slowly, just enough for the laughter behind him to become hollow, then fade completely into uncomfortable silence. The sky above the Celestial Symphony had transformed into a soft crimson as the sun began its descent into the Pacific. It was the evening of the captain's formal dinner, a black tie affair reserved exclusively for those deemed distinguished enough to dine beneath the magnificent crystal chandeliers of the grand ballroom. Guests glittered in custom tuxedos and haute couture gowns. Conversation floated like expensive perfume, and the atmosphere pulsed with the kind of smug satisfaction only the exceptionally privileged ever truly mastered. Every element of the evening, from the hand-engraved silverware to the live chamber orchestra, had been precisely orchestrated to flatter the egos of those in attendance. Keanu entered quietly through a side entrance. Maxwell Thornton muttered from across the ballroom, loudly enough to halt conversation at adjacent tables. He stood, champagne flute in hand, and pointed directly at Keanu as if identifying an intruder in a sacred space. "Security!" Maxwell called out, eyes gleaming with malice. "We have a dress code violation or perhaps a charity case. I honestly cannot differentiate." Laughter erupted from his table, louder, more cutting than before. A woman with earrings that cost more than most people's annual salary smirked and added, "Perhaps he's delivering our entrees. If so, he's woefully tardy." Another guest joined in, "No, he's probably here to service the facilities. Should have arrived in proper uniform though might have earned gratuity." Keanu remained silent, standing where he was, hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. But Maxwell wasn't finished. He was thriving now. This was sport to him. "You know," he said, raising his voice further, drawing attention from across the ballroom, "it's genuinely offensive that someone believes they can simply walk into this environment looking like that. This isn't a community shelter, this is a luxury vessel, and I've personally invested millions to ensure it maintains that standard." Keanu finally took a step forward. The room had fallen deathly silent, even the orchestra had stopped playing. Maxwell scoffed derisively. "You truly don't comprehend, do you? You don't belong in this space. You're not one of us. You're not even remotely close." A moment passed. No one moved. No one intervened. Then Maxwell delivered his final assault, his voice saturated with venom. "You're a nobody dressed like an oversight, and the only reason anyone has noticed your existence is because you look like the only person aboard who could be mistaken for the cleaning equipment." The silence that followed was thick, oppressive, uncomfortable. Keanu stood motionless, absorbing it all. His eyes surveyed the room not with judgment, but with something worse, understanding. He observed every face, every coward who remained silent, every smirk that had now faded, every glass raised in mockery, every mouth that had participated in the laughter. Then, without anger, without sarcasm, without even elevating his voice, he said, "You've just confirmed something I hoped wasn't true." Maxwell blinked, momentarily confused. "And what might that be?" Keanu held his gaze steadily. "That wealth can purchase the vessel, but not the humanity that should inhabit it." And with that, he turned and walked out. No one attempted to stop him. They were too stunned, too uncomfortable, too exposed. And none of them, especially Maxwell Thornton, had the slightest inkling of whom they had just humiliated before the entire assembly. But they would discover this truth very, very soon. The evening air surrounding the Celestial Symphony had grown cool, but inside the grand ballroom, the temperature felt as though it had plummeted significantly. The chandeliers continued to shimmer, the glasses still clinked melodiously, the chamber orchestra had resumed their performance, but something had shifted, subtly yet powerfully, since the man in the hoodie had departed in dignified silence. Maxwell Thornton returned to his seat with a triumphant smirk, raising his champagne flute once more. "Well," he said to his companions, "that should establish a precedent. No undesirables in our sanctuary. Agreed?" But before anyone could respond, the lights dimmed. All conversation ceased as the cruise director approached the elegant podium. A single spotlight illuminated her figure. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice clear, warm, and entirely unaware of the storm she was about to unleash, "before we proceed with tonight's charity auction, we have a very special announcement." Some guests straightened in their chairs. Maxwell barely glanced up, swirling the champagne in his glass with practiced indifference. "As many of you are aware," the director continued, "this exclusive voyage was made possible through the generous support of several distinguished sponsors. However, One contribution significantly surpassed all others. One benefactor who requested anonymity covered nearly 60% of this journey's expenses and pledged $5 million to our cause before even boarding. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Maxwell frowned slightly. $5 million? Anonymous? The director smiled warmly and directed her gaze toward the ballroom entrance. "It is now my profound honor," she said, "to formally introduce the individual whose extraordinary generosity made this evening and indeed this entire voyage possible. A person known not only for his philanthropy but for his remarkable humility and grace." Chairs scraped against the marble floor. A woman dropped her champagne flute. It shattered, completely forgotten. And there he was emerging quietly from the corridor just as he had entered 3 nights before. Hoodie still on, cap still low, calm as ever. Keanu Reeves walked toward the spotlight. One man near the front clutched his chest in disbelief. "Good God, it's him!" A cluster of influencers along the periphery whispered frantically, "That's Keanu Reeves. Oh my God, that's actually him. What have we done?" The color drained from Maxwell's face as though someone had extracted all blood from beneath his skin. He rose slowly, disbelieving. "No," he muttered, "no, it cannot be. That man was him." But the realization had already dawned, and there was no undoing what had transpired. Keanu stepped onto the stage, nodded respectfully to the director, then turned to face the room that had mocked him, measured him, stripped him of worth based on nothing but fabric and silence. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't glare accusingly. He simply began to speak. "I didn't come here to be recognized," he said, his gaze sweeping across the assembled guests. "I didn't come to make a statement or wear formal attire or receive applause. I came to understand, to witness, without the influence of celebrity, how people treat others when there's nothing apparent to gain." The room was utterly still, all eyes fixed upon him. Some lowered their gaze in shame. "I was judged by my clothing, ridiculed for my appearance, rejected by those who never even inquired about my identity," he continued, each word landing like a weight in the silence. He paused, allowing the tension to envelop every conscience present. "And yet, what I observed wasn't novel. It wasn't unique to this vessel. It's something more fundamental. It's the disease of measuring human worth by superficial standards." He turned his gaze, calm but penetrating, toward Maxwell. "Especially when the loudest voices belong to the smallest spirits." Maxwell opened his mouth, but no sound emerged, just a nervous chuckle, a half-step backward. Keanu didn't waver. "I harbor no anger," he said softly, "but I do feel profound disappointment." With that, he departed from the podium, walking through a parting sea of silence. No applause. No cameras dared capture the moment. Just breathless, shame-filled stillness. Because they hadn't humiliated nobody, they had humiliated Keanu Reeves, the man who had paid for the champagne they toasted with, the accommodations they enjoyed, the music they appreciated. And in doing so, they had revealed everything about themselves. Silence persisted long after Keanu Reeves had stepped away from the stage, a silence that seemed to subdue even the ocean itself. The grand ballroom of the Celestial Symphony, once vibrant with exaggerated laughter and the false confidence of inherited privilege, now felt vacant, like a theater after the final curtain when all pretenses have crumbled and no one dares speak their authentic lines. Guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, eyes darting nervously as if attempting to erase what had already been seared into memory. Some attempted polite smiles, the kind reserved for funerals. Others reached for champagne with trembling hands, not to celebrate but to forget. And at the very center of it all, Maxwell Thornton sat immobilized, like a wax figure suddenly exposed to genuine heat. His knuckles whitened around the stem of his untouched champagne, his face so often composed in smug authority now displayed something rare and raw, disbelief, disorientation, and beneath it all, fear. Not fear of Keanu Reeves as an individual, but fear of what he himself had become under the weight of a spotlight he could no longer manipulate. At his table, no one engaged him in conversation. The women who had laughed enthusiastically at his jokes moments earlier now stared intently at their plates. The venture capitalist who had clinked glasses with him repositioned himself 3 seats away. A young influencer who had whispered insults about Keanu frantically deleted her social media posts, her fingers quivering visibly. The ship's captain approached Maxwell discreetly from behind, his voice measured and deliberate. "Mr. Thornton," he said, "Mr. Reeves has specifically requested that his donation remain anonymous and that no further public acknowledgments be made in his honor." Maxwell turned slightly, his jaw clenched tightly. "Of course he did," he muttered, his voice brittle and strained. The captain maintained his composure. "However," he added, "he did leave a message specifically for you." Maxwell stiffened noticeably. "For me?" The captain unfolded a small handwritten note and placed it gently on the table beside Maxwell's untouched appetizer. No one leaned forward to read it, no one dared inquire. Maxwell lifted it with mechanical slowness, as though it might burn him. It read, in simple, elegant handwriting. "You taught me something I already knew. Some were luxury as armor, others as masks. You selected the wrong approach. Kr." Maxwell folded the paper once, then again and again until it nearly disappeared in his palm. But nothing could fold away the sting contained in those words. Nothing could diminish the weight now pressing against his conscience. From across the room, a woman he had danced with hours earlier stood and whispered to her companion, "I once thought he possessed power. It turns out he's merely loud." The comment affected him more profoundly than any direct insult could have. Outside the ballroom, on the lower deck where the ocean met steel, Keanu leaned quietly against the railing, the night breeze gently ruffling his hair. He gazed out at the open water, boundless and serene. A young staff member passed by, hesitated, then turned back. "Mr. Reeves," the young man said nervously, I just wanted to express my gratitude for how you handled that situation." Keanu smiled faintly. "You needn't thank me." "But I must," the young man replied, his voice slightly unsteady. "Because if someone like you can be treated that way, then people like me stand little chance." Keanu turned fully toward him now, his voice low and certain. "No, it means we all possess a choice, to emulate them or to aspire to something better." The young man stood a little straighter as he walked away. Behind them, the ship continued its journey across the Pacific, but everything had transformed, not the decor, not the entertainment, but the mirror in which everyone now saw themselves reflected. And for Maxwell Thornton, who had once believed he owned this voyage, it had become painfully, humiliatingly evident that he never truly belonged on it at all. The following morning felt like the aftermath of an invisible tempest. Sunlight cascaded gently across the deck of the Celestial Symphony, but its warmth couldn't penetrate the coldness that lingered beneath the skin of those who remained aboard. The opulence remained intact: the marble floors, the polished brass railings, the soothing sound of waves caressing the hull, but it now existed like an empty facade, stripped of the illusions it once carried. Whispers traveled faster than the ocean breeze. The name, Keanu Reeves, had been uttered in nearly every corner of the ship, first in disbelief, then in stunned recognition, and finally in a hushed tone born from collective guilt. Some passengers attempted to justify their behavior, claiming ignorance: they hadn't known, hadn't heard, hadn't participated in the mockery. Others remained silent, consumed by a shame too profound to wash away with mere apologies. Maxwell Thornton didn't appear at breakfast. He hadn't spoken since receiving the note. In his private suite, curtains drawn tightly against the daylight, he sat at the edge of the bed, his tie loosened, his shirt wrinkled from a sleepless night. The man who once traversed the decks as though they were his personal domain now stared vacantly at his reflection in the mirror, a face no longer smug, no longer confident, just exposed and vulnerable. His assistant knocked tentatively before cautiously entering. "Mr. Thornton, the media has begun reaching out. Apparently, someone recorded portions of last night's address. It's already gaining significant traction online." Maxwell remained silent, barely acknowledging the information. The assistant shifted uncomfortably, then added, "There's also correspondence from Mr. Reeves' representatives. They've declined all media interview requests. He desires no publicity, only peace." A prolonged silence passed before Maxwell finally spoke, his voice low and fractured. "That's what makes this infinitely worse." He dismissed the assistant with a gesture, then stood and walked slowly toward the window. He pulled back the curtain, not to admire the ocean view but to catch one final glimpse of the tender boat quietly departing, cutting across the glassy surface of the water. On it stood Keanu, shoulders relaxed, gaze fixed on the horizon, utterly untouched by the aftermath he had left in his wake. But it wasn't destruction born of anger or vengeance, it was silence and dignity and truth in their purest forms. On the lower deck, a handful of crew members stood at attention, hands clasped respectfully before them. Among them was the young server from the previous evening, the one who had witnessed Keanu walk away from that humiliating confrontation without a single raised voice. He whispered to a colleague, he didn't need cameras or statements. He simply needed to show them who they truly were. And that was precisely what he had accomplished. In the grand ballroom, the captain gathered the remaining guests for one final address, his voice steady but underscored with quiet resolve. This voyage was never intended to be about status or prestige. It was meant to embody generosity, compassion, and character. Last night reminded us all how far we still have to journey. He held up the second note Keanu had left behind, not for any individual but for all present. Dignity isn't lost when you wear less. It's lost when you treat others as less. Silence followed his words. Some nodded slowly in acknowledgement, others turned away, their shame still too raw to confront directly. As the Celestial Symphony continued its course across the Pacific, it did so with fewer conversations, fewer photographs, and fewer illusions. The tuxedos still gleamed immaculately, the champagne still flowed abundantly, but something fundamental had shattered. And for Maxwell Thornton, that fracture would never heal, because some wounds, especially those carved by truth, don't bleed. They echo. Weeks had passed since the Celestial Symphony docked for the final time, but the story of what transpired aboard had only begun to ripple outward. It began inconspicuously, a single video uploaded by a deeply affected crew member, capturing the moment Keanu Reeves stepped onto the stage. No hashtags, no caption, just the unvarnished truth. Within hours, it spread virally, not because it was sensational, but because it was authentic and powerful. People worldwide watched as a man dressed in simplicity, wrapped in humility, stood before a room of opulence and shattered every illusion that wealth had ever constructed. They witnessed not merely an actor but a mirror reflecting uncomfortable truths. Maxwell Thornton's name vanished from exclusive invitation lists. His business partnerships dissolved. He ceased appearing in boardrooms and eventually stopped speaking in crowded venues altogether. He had built his empire on the illusion of influence, but all it took was one man refusing to raise his voice to bring it crashing down around him. As for Keanu, he never discussed the incident publicly. He never needed to. But in a quiet corner of a small bookshop in Los Angeles, a handwritten note appeared taped to the window, a quote inscribed in an elegant, flowing script. "Status is conferred by others, but dignity is a personal choice." And beneath it, just two initials, KR. Appearance doesn't define a person. Fame doesn't determine worth. The only thing that truly defines you is how you treat someone when you believe they have nothing to offer in return. In a world obsessed with appearances and superficial judgment, be the one who remembers that dignity doesn't require recognition, it only needs to be upheld. Have you ever looked at someone and thought they didn't belong only to realize you were wrong? Let's be honest with ourselves. Comment your story below. If this story stirred something in your heart, don't let it stay silent. Share it. Speak up. Subscribe. Motivation for success. Let's change the way we see worth, one story at a time.